This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this tutorial I'd like to provide students with some help studying Chapter 4 of Book 1 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which we study in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Classical Ethics course. This lesson can provide students with some difficulty, so I'd like to walk through it line by line and make sure everything is simple and clear for students, because as this is an early lesson in the course, it contains some important ideas that we're going to build upon as we study classical ethics. Before I get started, I'd like to say that as students get more advanced, there is a complete commentary on Aristotle's ethics written by, or at least spoken by, St. Thomas Aquinas, which is available online at no cost. But I would save that for a later study for more mature students. If you're getting started your first time through in Aristotle's ethics, I think that this discussion will be sufficient to help you get started and understand the key points in this lesson. So let's go ahead and begin. Let's begin by reading the first sentence from Chapter 4 of Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle writes, "Repeating, therefore, what we have said, since all knowledge and deliberate choice aspires after a certain good, let us show what that is which we say the political science desires, and what the supreme good is of all actions." So Aristotle began the ethics by talking about the simple fact that all intentional, voluntary, human actions seem to be directed at some end. In other words, people don't do things randomly. It seems that they have an end in view and they pursue it by their intentional actions. And Aristotle's explained that it's a most important study for us to pursue the knowledge of what the supreme good, what the ultimate end. In catechism, you might see the phrase chief end. What is the chief end of man? What is man's ultimate good that all of our actions should be aiming towards? Repeating what we have said, since all knowledge and deliberate choice aspires after a certain good, let us show what that is which we say the political science desires, and what the supreme good is of all actions. The second important point here is that Aristotle mentions the political science, the science of politics, because he's explained that seeking the highest good for an individual man is good. That's our own personal mission in life. We can call that monastic or individual ethics. And then we can even expand that to family or domestic ethics and household management. But then when we consider other families, our responsibility for all men, that's where we begin the study of the science of politics. And in order for us to do anything wisely in politics, we have to understand what the supreme good is, the ultimate good that all men are to be seeking, because there's no way for us to define the common good that we're to seek unless we first establish the knowledge of that supreme good. Since all knowledge and deliberate choice aspires after a certain good, let us show what that is which we say the political science desires, and what the supreme good is of all actions. Aristotle says, "By name, therefore, it is nearly acknowledged by most men. For both the vulgar and the learned call it felicity. So this supreme good, this good to which all human actions are directed, is not difficult for us to understand. In fact, most men know it by name. It's called felicity. Felicity, or happiness, is the chief end of man. He mentions that this name, felicity, is known and spoken of by most men, both the vulgar and the learned. The word vulgar means common people, people who don't have a philosophical education, common people. When we talk about modern schools, we talk about public schools or common schools. Even though many go to school, they're still considered vulgar because their knowledge is simply the knowledge of the common people, the common knowledge. You may have even heard of the phrase common sense. It's sort of the knowledge that is possessed by the common people. The common people, the vulgar, understand this, that men seek happiness. And not just the vulgar, but also the learned, after their philosophical studies. And remember, by learned, we're not talking about people who go to modern colleges or universities and get modern degrees. We're talking about those who are truly learned, who have studied the philosophical sciences, true philosophy. We find that if we ask those who have studied true philosophy, the learned, what is the chief end that all human actions tend toward, we'll find that they say the same thing as the vulgar or common people. Both the vulgar and the learned, both the common people and the wise men, call that end felicity or happiness. Aristotle then says, but they conceive that to live well and to act well are the same thing as to be happy. Now this is a problem because you can see it's sort of a circular argument. We're asking the question, what is the chief end or chief good, the supreme good that all men should seek? And in answer to that question, we answer with this statement, well, to be happy means to live well or to act well. That's what it means to be happy. And the problem again with that answer is that it assumes what we're seeking to understand. If we don't understand what the supreme good is, how can we know what it means to live well or to act well? We can't talk about living or acting well until we clearly understand the supreme good, what it means to actually be happy. Aristotle then explains, concerning felicity, however, what it is, they are dubious. That means doubtful or uncertain. Concerning felicity, what it is, they are doubtful. And the multitude do not form the same opinion of it as the wise. So there's disagreement, there's uncertainty. Even though everyone will answer the question, what is man's supreme good, with the answer happiness or felicity, once we begin to press them to explain what felicity is, we'll find that no one really knows. That the common people, the multitude, the vulgar, and the wise disagree on what happiness actually is. So we can't be content with the simple answer, happiness. We can't be content with this explanation that to live well is happiness, because we're assuming the answer when we don't yet have the answer. Concerning felicity, what it is, they are dubious. and the multitude do not form the same opinion of it as the wise. Since there's this doubt, many think they know, but when pressed, like I said, we find they don't know. We need to investigate this question. We need to investigate this subject and study to understand what felicity actually is. Next, Aristotle begins to discuss the nature of their disagreement. He says, some of them, indeed, conceive felicity to rank among the number of things which are clear and evident, such as pleasure or wealth or honor, but others assert it to be something else. Some conceive it to rank among the number of things which are clear and evident. And what people will do when you ask a question like this is they'll often say, oh, come on, everyone knows that. Everyone knows that. And we take it for granted that something is known when in fact it's not known. And if we press and ask for clarification, we find that there are common answers that will be given. Some people will say, well, it's pleasure, avoiding pain, enjoying good health, not getting sick, being free from harm, or positive pleasure seeking, enjoying good food and a comfortable home and pleasures of the body. That's happiness, to enjoy pleasure. Others may say to possess wealth is happiness, to not be anxious for tomorrow, to know that there's enough money in the bank for a few months to live on. Some may say that it's honor, being respected and holding an honorable position in society, or having a reputation that will live long after one's death. So there will be these common answers, but we see men don't agree on what felicity actually is, and others will assert it to be yet something else. So while many people think that this is easy to understand, when asked, we find it's not so easy to understand, and men don't agree on what it actually is. Frequently, likewise, the same person forms a different opinion of it. So Aristotle says not only do different men disagree on what felicity is, but we will also find the same person at different times in his life will define felicity differently. The same person forms a different opinion of it. For when diseased, he conceives it to be health. When poor, he considers happiness to be riches. So again, not only do different men hold different opinions on what felicity is, but even the same men can be found at different times in their lives to have a different answer to the question. At one time we look and we see a man whose only concern in life is to try to regain his health when he's sick. He doesn't care about food, doesn't care about pleasure, doesn't care about wealth or honor. He says, all that matters is your health. And then we find that man at another time laboring and working and sacrificing sleep to gain riches, explaining that what matters is earning one's living and having some money put away, being able to retire, being able to provide for your family, and so on. So the same man will even define felicity differently at different times in his life. The answer, what is felicity, is not clear. Another problem, Aristotle says, is that those who are conscious of their ignorance Those who, when asked, will admit that they really don't know the answer, what felicity is. They admire those who assert something grand and above their comprehension. They hear someone talking about some, high and lofty idea of felicity, and they're impressed by that because they think that's because it's simply above their comprehension. It must be true, or it must be better than their opinion. So there's doubt and uncertainty, even when people can see that they don't understand it, which is a good first step in the pursuit of wisdom. First, learning that we don't know, having that spirit of Socrates who said he knows nothing. This is what he meant. He meant that while men think they understand things, if we really press ourselves and press one another through discussion, we'll find we really don't understand things that we think we understand. And often when we are conscious that we don't know something, we tend to be impressed by the lofty talk of those who act as if they do know something. And Aristotle warns us that this doesn't necessarily lead us to the truth. Aristotle then says that some too, besides these many goods, the goods that he's listed, some, besides these, are of opinion that there is another good subsisting by itself, which is the cause to all these of their being good. And this sentence here can be a cause of some confusion because we get into some philosophical talk and philosophical ideas that'll be new to students getting started in philosophy. So let's take a look at this sentence here. Some, besides these many goods, we've talked about pleasure and health and riches and honor, for example. Some go beyond these. Some are more philosophical, and they say, no, we don't think that these things are the chief end. We think there's something above and beyond them. We think that there is some other good, and it's almost as if we should make the G capitalized, some other good which subsists or exists by itself above all these things. This universal good, or this ultimate good, the highest good, it's sort of a philosophical idea. And that this idea of good, capital G, good, is the cause that leads us to call other things good. So imagine if we saw the idea of the color green, and we were shown the color green in its ideal form, and then we were sent out into the world, and all of a sudden we started to see things that appeared to be green, and we would say, oh, those leaves are green, and that plant is green, and that frog is green, and that woman's blouse is green. And we went around identifying things that are green. How would we know that they're green? Why do we call those things green? Because we've learned what capital G green is, the ultimate green, the pattern of what it means to be green, greenness. And now we can look around and see that in different bodies. So there's an ultimate green, if you bear with me in this illustration. Aristotle says that some wise men believed that there is an ultimate good, or a perfect good, an idea of goodness, and that it's this that we see in different things, and that's the cause why we call these things good. Now, if we want to answer this question, we obviously have a problem. The problem is that there have been so many different answers to this question. how ought we to investigate them? Should we go through all of the different options and put them all to the test? That might be impossible. How should we go about this study? Well, this is where Aristotle begins to lead us away from this confusion, out from this doubt and uncertainty, into the beginning of the science of moral philosophy or ethics. Aristotle says here, to examine, therefore, all the opinions would perhaps be a vain undertaking. It would be useless to go through every one of these opinions, because every single person could have a different opinion, and we've also seen that individuals have different opinions at different times. So to examine all of these opinions would likely be a vain or useless undertaking. But it will be sufficient to consider those opinions that are the most eminent, or which appear to be in some respect reasonable. So let's consider the best answers to this question. Let's consider the answers that have been held by the wisest and best men. Let's consider their opinions, not the opinions of all men. That would be impossible. But let's look at history's wisest and best men, and let's investigate their answers to this question, those which are most eminent, those which appear to be reasonable. So we're going to choose some opinions of what felicity is, and focusing on studying them so we can try to gain some science of moral philosophy, some certain knowledge, clear knowledge of what felicity is, the supreme good of man's life. So how do we go about this study? Where do we begin? Aristotle talks to us now about the method of pursuing this kind of knowledge. He says, we must not, however, be ignorant that arguments from principles and to principles differ from each other. We must not be ignorant that arguments from principles and to principles differ from each other. So as I said, here Aristotle begins to talk about the method, and this is a general philosophical method of seeking answers to these questions or investigating these subjects. There are different kinds of arguments, and when we read arguments from principles and arguments to principles, that can be confusing when you're getting started with philosophy, but I can explain it and make it very, very simple. This is not a difficult concept to understand. There are arguments from principles, and there are arguments to principles. So the first question that we need to answer is, well, what are principles? Principles are universal truths. Principles are starting points in reasoning. They're the big ideas. They're the ideas that we start with and which we reason from. They're universal ideas. So, for example, in modern science, how do we seek knowledge in modern science? We seek it by experiments. We seek it by observation. So if you want to seek a knowledge of, let's say, insects, by the method of modern science, the scientific method, what you'll do is you'll start observing, examining insects, maybe collecting insects, and you'll start simply looking at them. Maybe you'll weigh them on a scale, look at parts of their body and cells of their body, parts of their wings or skin under a microscope. You'll simply observe and examine individual specimens of the different objects that you'd like to study. That's how we gather information using the modern scientific method. This is called inductive reasoning, because what we seek to do is not simply learn some curious facts or information about individual insects or animals or plants or anything else. We seek to study individuals and then draw conclusions about all animals of that type. So if I collect lightning bugs and I spend a few months studying hundreds and hundreds of lightning bugs, and I notice that all of the lightning bugs have these common characteristics, common behaviors, common features, common body parts, and so on, I can begin to move from talking about individual lightning bugs to talking about the entire class of lightning bugs. I can say all lightning bugs have wings. All lightning bugs have an abdomen that lights up somehow. I can move from individual observations to universal conclusions or principles that I suggest are true of all members of that class. That's what it means to argue two principles from individual things up to general principles. That's what's called, as I said, inductive philosophy, because the word inductive means leading up to. Inductive, leading up to principles. That's how we study and seek truth in modern science. And you can probably see that that's not very helpful, because the quality or the certainty of your knowledge, the principles that you draw, are usually just theories, because you can only observe a small number of a certain class of objects, and so your conclusions are drawn from a limited number of samples or observations. And so it's not absolutely certain, but it's helpful, and sometimes it's probable that your principles will be true, but it's not absolutely certain. That's what it means to argue two principles from observations, from using the senses, up to general conclusions drawn about entire classes of things. Arguing from principles is the opposite. Arguing from principles means we start with a universal principle or truth about an entire class of things. And then when we look at an individual member of that class, we reason from the principle down to the individual. So for example, if I were to ask you, am I going to die one day? Am I going to die? How would we know? I'm still alive. There's no way scientifically to say that I'm going to die, unless you simply reason from probability, since everyone else dies and I'm like everyone else, that I'm probably going to die too. That would be inductive reasoning. But this other kind of argument, this other kind of reasoning from principles down to individuals, would start with some universal truth and then apply that truth to me as an individual. So for example, I could say, all men are mortal. All men are mortal. William Michael is a man. Therefore, reasoning from the principle down to the individual, we make this conclusion that William Michael is mortal and will die. That's reasoning from principles, or arguing from principles down to individual things, and that's called deductive reasoning. Deductive means leading down from principles to individuals. So Aristotle points out two kinds of arguments, two different methods of seeking truth. Inductive, like we use in modern science, and deductive, which is used in philosophy. Aristotle then says, Plato well doubts about and investigates this, whether the way is from principles or to principles, as in a race from the president of the games to the goal, or the contrary. So let's understand this sentence. First of all, who is Plato? Aristotle was the greatest of the Greek philosophers. But Aristotle enjoyed the benefit of having some excellent teachers, and his primary teacher was another Greek philosopher named Plato. So Aristotle's referring here to his teacher, who is, like Aristotle, one of the most famous philosophers, one of the greatest wise men to ever live. And it's important for us to note that Aristotle's saying even Plato wasn't really sure about what the best way is to answer this question about felicity. Plato himself doubted. He wasn't sure. He disputed this, questioned this. He wasn't sure whether the way, that is the way to the truth, whether the way is arguing from principles, like a philosopher, or to principles, more like a modern scientist. And he gives us an illustration, as in a race from the president of the games to the goal, or from the goal to the president of the games. And the president means one who presides over or who oversees the athletic contests, the games, the Olympic Games. Is the right way to seek the truth like running from the goal to the judge, or from the judge to the goal? That's a question that Plato said wasn't so simple. So Aristotle tells us this because he wants us to respect the difficulty of this question. Even Plato was uncertain about this. And so Aristotle is going to try to give us not only the answer for how we should seek this knowledge, but why we should seek this knowledge in a certain way. So let's keep reading. Aristotle says, we must begin from things that are known. If we want to understand things that are unknown to us, there's only one way to start, Aristotle says. There's only one way to seek to understand things that are unknown. We have to begin from things that are known. That seems very simple. It doesn't seem like any of us would need to be convinced that in order to seek the knowledge of unknown things, we have to begin with the things that we know. A good example of this that clarifies this is how Jesus teaches in the parables. He says, how can you understand heavenly things if you don't understand when I speak of earthly things? And Jesus uses parables to explain heavenly things which are impossible for us to know about because none of us have ever been to heaven. We can't even imagine what heaven is like. We can't imagine what the angels are like. So Jesus explains things to us because he is the great teacher. He explains things to us by comparing unknown things to things that we know. He says, the kingdom of heaven is like a seed. You understand what a seed is like and how a seed grows? Well, the kingdom of heaven is like a seed. Jesus teaches us unknown things by means of things that are known. Aristotle says that's how we learn. So rather than sitting around debating as to whether we should argue from principles or to principles and have doubt like Plato, let's just start with a simple fact. We must begin from things that are known. That's simple. However, he says, these subsist in a twofold respect. What does that mean? These subsist in a twofold respect. We must begin from things that are known. That sounds simple. The problem is that things that are known are of two different kinds. There's two different kinds of things that are known, or things that can be known. So the idea is simple. We're going to start from the things that we understand and know, and we're going to move on to understand the things that we don't know. But the problem is that things that we know are of two different kinds. And so Aristotle is going to explain to us what these two different kinds of known things are. So let's keep reading. Aristotle says, some things are known to us, but other things are simply known. Some things are known to us, but other things are simply known. And as you're getting started in philosophy, I don't expect for you to understand what he means here. So let's unpack this a little bit. There are two different kinds of things that are known. There are things known to us, and there are things that are simply known. Now, when he says to us, what he means are to human beings. There are things that are known to human beings, and these are things that are known to all human beings. These are things that are commonly known. He's referring to, more or less, he's referring to what we call common sense. There are things known to us, to men. And how do we know these things? We know them by our senses. We know hot and cold. We know light and dark. We know different colors. We know different feelings, different smells. We hear different sounds. There's a simple human knowledge, one kind of thing that's known to us, and it's known simply by living in the world as sensible creatures who are seeing and hearing and tasting and smelling and feeling all day, every day. There are things that are known to us. This is common knowledge, things that we all experience in common. But there's another kind of knowledge. There's another kind of known thing, things that are simply known. And this can be a little confusing. These are things that are not necessarily known to us through our senses. These are not necessarily known to all men or commonly known, but they're a little more complicated than that. So one class of things are things that are known to us, and then there's another class of things that are simply known, or not known to us by the senses, but known in a different way. And he's going to talk about that coming up. Let's go on. Aristotle says, perhaps, therefore, since there are two different kinds of known things, perhaps we should begin from things that are known to us. Begin with things that are commonly known among men, just by the use of our senses in daily life. Now, I'd like to just explain this a little bit, because Aristotle explains this in his other philosophical works, namely in the physics. So if you study classical physics, when you get into the first chapters of classical physics, Aristotle begins with this same discussion about things that are known to us and things that are simply known. Let's understand this in an easy way. When you look at something, let's say you look at a car driving down the road. Let's say a little child, a 10-year-old boy, looks out into the street and he sees a car go past. And he sees a red car. Let's say it's a red Corvette. He sees the car go past, and he points to it and says, "Look, it's a car." And he may say it's a red car. He may say it's a fast car. He may say it's an expensive car. He sees the car, and as a child who doesn't know very much about cars, he thinks about the car as a whole thing. He thinks of it as a whole and calls it a car. And he really doesn't understand the difference between that Corvette and a Mustang or a BMW or another car. He can point to them and say, that's a car, that's a car, that's a car. He has a simple knowledge or a common knowledge of a car. Now, think of a mechanic, a man who, through years of study and training and work, has taken apart cars and reassembled them. He knows every part of the car. He knows the form of every part of the car. He knows the function of every part of the car. When that mechanic looks at a car, he doesn't look at it in the same way that the 10-year-old boy looks at it. The 10-year-old boy looks at it and just sees a car. The mechanic looks and sees wheels and axles and windows and windshield wipers and tail lights, exhaust pipes, all the different parts. He can imagine all of the parts of the car, even though he can't see them on the road. He knows all the parts of the car because he has taken cars apart and put them back together. He knows all their parts, how they work. He understands the car by analyzing the car, by taking it apart and putting it back together again. So the 10-year-old boy has a certain knowledge of a car, and a mechanic has a different kind of knowledge of a car. So there are two different kinds of things known. There are things known to us that is common knowledge, and then there is a thing known to a person who has studied and analyzed the subject, who understands all of the parts and the causes of the thing. He can explain what the thing is. By definition, he can explain the cause of what makes it to be what it is. He can explain all of its parts, how they work, how the whole car works, by explaining the operation of all of its parts. That's a different kind of knowledge. Now, this is just an illustration, but the point is, common knowledge is usually a knowledge of whole things as they appear to our senses, whereas that kind of knowledge which is simply known is a knowledge that's only understood by one who has studied and analyzed the thing and understands its true essence or definition, understands its parts, understands what causes it to be what it is, how it operates, what its purpose is, and so on. Two different kinds of knowledge, and I think if you keep the image of the boy pointing to the red car and the mechanic imagining all of the parts working inside the car, you understand in a simple way what it means to know something as it's known to us and as it's simply known, or more philosophically understood. That's what Aristotle's talking about here. And like I said, he explains that in more detail in his opening chapters on classical physics. Now moving on, Aristotle says, hence, therefore, since it's reasonable that we should begin with things that are known to us, hence, it is necessary that the auditor of discussions about things beautiful and just, and in short about political concerns, if he is to be benefited, should be adorned with worthy manners. It is necessary that the auditor, that is a student, someone who is listening to instruction or listening to discussions about this subject, about things that are beautiful and just, things that are good, about political concerns, about the concerns of the happiness of all men. The kind of people who should or who will listen to these discussions, listen to these lessons, read these lessons, and so on, if he is going to be benefited from these discussions, should be adorned with worthy manners. In other words, Aristotle here is saying, what kind of person can learn about the supreme good? What kind of person can learn the truth about what is actually good, the greatest good of the human life, what political science should be concerned with? A man has to be adorned with worthy manners. Now, to illustrate this and make it clear, when I teach grammar lessons to children, especially English grammar, because English is our native language, I tell my students that most of the students whom I teach really don't need to study English grammar because they learn proper English grammar simply by speaking like their parents. Most of the children have parents who are fairly well educated. They have good speaking habits. They can write clearly and so on. And children learn to speak and read and write rightly by simply imitating their parents. And so when you have a father or a mother who speaks clearly, you're going to learn to speak clearly by simply speaking like your mother or your father, by imitation. And you're going to recognize bad grammar because it's not going to sound the way that your mother or father speaks. You're going to have a sense of what's good and what's bad. If it's like the way that mom and dad speak, it's good. If it's not like the way they speak, if it's something that mom or dad would never say, it's probably bad. That's how we learn, by imitation. And that's why studying English grammar is often not necessary if parents are careful to speak and write rightly and have their children learn by imitation. Another illustration to make this clear is if you have a dollar bill and you have a real dollar bill, you can look at another dollar bill and judge whether it's a real dollar bill or a fake dollar bill because you know what a real dollar bill looks like. So what Aristotle's saying here is if a student is trained to have good manners, if he's disciplined and he's instructed by his parents to have good manners, he has a benefit in these discussions about what is good because he's already become familiar with what it looks and feels like to be good. In the ancient Greek world, in Aristotle's world that he lived in, young boys, were given two kinds of instruction when they were young, two important parts of their education when they were young boys. And we don't do this today. But they were given two important studies. One was called gymnastics, where they learned about physical exercise, and they learned to do things like wrestle and run and climb and jump, what we would consider Olympic-like games. And they also learned music. And gymnastics and music were sort of the elementary education of the Greek children. And the reason why they taught them gymnastics and music was because it gave the boys good manners. The athletic exercises taught them to be strong, made them healthy, made them able to work. They weren't weak and lazy and fussy about things. They were trained to be physically strong and healthy. And when they were in the gymnasium, when they were in the wrestling room or in the exercise room, they could see the older boys and men with fully developed bodies, with their muscles and their strength and all of their balance and coordination and skill, and they could see what it means to be excellent. And they would have an idea of strength and health and courage and excellence, and they would learn to imitate that in their own daily exercise and training. Just like children do today who play sports, who look up at the pro athletes or the Olympic athletes and say, they're the best, they're the models. That's excellence. And imitate or seek to learn to imitate that excellence in their daily practices and contests. So that was one part of Greek education, and the other was music, so that the children could learn through music what it feels like to experience harmonic sounds or harmony, to understand that feeling of balance and peace and beauty, agreement, and so on. And the Greeks believed that gymnastics and music trained young children to have good manners. And the reason why they were so concerned with training them to have good manners was because, as Aristotle explains here, in order to study moral philosophy, you need to begin with good manners, manners that are trained in you. So when we look at children and we say, those children are well behaved, those children have good manners, it simply means that they do what their parents have taught them to do. And it's not true virtue, what those children do. They're simply trained to do that. They're made to do that. Their parents may punish them if they don't do it. Their parents may reward them when they do it. They may clean their room, not because they value cleanness, but because they're promised a treat if their room is clean. So they're given good manners by parental training. But that's just the beginning of moral training, of moral philosophy. But it's an important beginning. So Aristotle here says that the auditor or listener, student of discussions about things beautiful and just, and in short about political concerns, if he is to be benefited, should be adorned with worthy manners. That's one of the requirements for success in the study of moral philosophy. So if you're a student who desires to be good, you desire to be wise and virtuous, you have the right disposition for these studies, and you're going to be benefited by these discussions. But if you're the kind of kid who doesn't want to be good, you mock good behavior or scoff at good behavior. You think good behavior is stupid, and you don't want to be like that. You like to disobey and be sneaky and deceitful. You're not going to be able to learn moral philosophy because it's foreign to you, and you're not going to have any understanding of it. So the first thing you've got to do is ask yourself whether you are practicing good manners, because that's the beginning of the study of moral philosophy, preparing yourself to study moral philosophy by being adorned with worthy manners. Aristotle says, for the principle is this. This is where moral philosophy or ethics starts. This is where understanding happiness starts. That the thing is so. A thing that is good or beautiful is simply good. It's simply beautiful. And if we have good manners, we can see that and sense that. When a person is evil, when a person is sinful, we often say they're reprobate. And their bad behavior, their sinful spirits, cause them to judge things falsely. But when someone has a good spirit, an obedient spirit, has good manners, they tend to judge things rightly. And the principle of moral philosophy, the principle of happiness is simply this, that the thing is so. And he explains in parentheses here, namely, that certain actions are worthy and others are unworthy. And we have a common sense knowledge of that, as long as we're not reprobate, as long as we're not corrupt morally. Certain actions are worthy and others are unworthy. And if this is sufficiently apparent, it is not at all requisite to know why it is so. If you simply know that this is good and this is bad, and you have the purity of judgment because you're not corrupted by a sinful spirit, you don't have sinful habits that you're committed to that distort your judgment and cause you to judge things unjustly, but you have a pure heart, like Jesus talks about, you will understand clearly what is good and what is bad, and you won't even need to understand why it's good or bad. You'll simply understand it, because that's how moral philosophy works. If we have good manners and seek to be good, we'll understand what's good and evil. But if we have sin dwelling in us, or if we're enslaved to some sinful behavior or desire, our judgment will be perverted or corrupted by our sin, and we will not be able to understand what's good or bad. The Bible says, woe to those who call good evil and evil good. Our sin can actually make us look at good things and judge them to be bad, and look at bad things and judge them to be good. When exorcists test to see if a person is being influenced by an evil spirit, they often show the person some holy thing, like a crucifix or a Bible or a picture of a saint. And if the person is being influenced by an evil spirit, the person will react nastily to a holy object, because the spirit of the person is corrupt, is unclean, and they despise holy things, whereas a person with a good spirit will be attracted to holy things. So when our spirits are good and we're disciplined and trained to have good manners, and we're accustomed to having good manners, it's easy and natural for us to know what's good and evil. Sometimes, however, our sins corrupt our judgment and can lead us into errors. In the book of Proverbs, the Holy Spirit says to us, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Having a sense of God's presence, fearing God's judgment, having that spirit of holy fear, which is good, having that spirit in us is the beginning of wisdom. Having good manners, being well trained in right and wrong behavior, is the beginning of wisdom. Aristotle then says, such a one either possesses or will easily acquire ethical principles. The principles, therefore, are in us. Ethical principles, the principles that the knowledge of good and evil are based on, these principles dwell in us. And a student who enters into moral philosophy, a student who enters into the study of ethics to become wise through the study of philosophy, either possesses these ethical principles in him, or he may easily acquire them because he has a good disposition, but maybe simply hasn't been trained yet. He simply hasn't had the instruction yet. So we find two different kinds of students who can do well in moral philosophy. Those who have been trained well, or who are simply blessed by God with good spirits, and they already have the principles of ethics dwelling in them. And there are other people who have a good disposition, but simply need the opportunity to study. That's why you'll often see that young people become Christians when they become adults, because it's the first opportunity they get to move away from a bad family and actually seek the good things that they desire. And they become good when they come away from their family. Other children are in good families, and when they come away from their families, they become bad. So there are two kinds of students. One who's well trained and already formed in good manners. That child already possesses the principle of moral philosophy within himself. But there are others who, even though they may not be already adorned with worthy manners, they have a right spirit and the right disposition. And when they're introduced to these studies, they'll benefit from them. Aristotle closes this chapter with a passage from a Greek writer named Hesiod. He says, "Let him who has neither of these hear what Hesiod says." Let him who has neither of these. What does that mean? If there is a person entering into the study of moral philosophy who is not adorned with worthy manners, or who doesn't have that right disposition, that is inclined to good morals, but it's a person who is who has a bad spirit, or who is for some reason turned against the principles of moral philosophy, that third person, the person with the bad spirit, who is thinking about becoming a student of moral philosophy, needs to hear what the poet Hesiod says. And in the next slide, I'm going to share with you the words that Hesiod wrote. But just so you know who Hesiod is, he's a Greek poet, and if you've ever heard of Homer, you know that Homer wrote around 750 BC. He wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, the great ancient Greek poet. Well, around that same time, around 700 BC, there was another Greek poet named Hesiod who wrote some important moral philosophical works. He wrote about the origin of the world and how things were formed at the beginning of time by the gods. So he was an ancient poet who wrote on moral and natural philosophy, and his name is pronounced Hesiod in English. So let's take a look at these lines from Hesiod that Aristotle would like us to read before we begin the study of moral philosophy. Hesiod wrote the following: "He the first rank of excellence maintains, who from himself in everything is wise, and what even to the end is best foresees. He too is good who yields to wise advice. But, and here's the warning, he who neither from himself is wise, nor to assent to others can endure, is but a useless, despicable man." So there are three kinds of students, Aristotle would say. The first and best is the man who from himself in everything is wise. That is, he has the right spirit and he is disposed to what is good. He delights in what is good. He's a blessed man. He's a man who has received grace. The first rank of excellence. The man who from himself in everything is wise, and what even to the end is best foresees. That's the best kind of person. A person who is blessed and gifted with goodness, who has the principles of wisdom and virtue in himself. The second kind of person, who is the second best, is the man who yields to wise advice. Who yields to wise advice. So he may not have that same spirit in him, that same goodness, but he listens to the advice of wise men. He listens to his teachers. He listens to wise men and follows their advice. That's the second kind of person, and he too is good. He too is good, who yields to wise advice. But the third kind of person is he who neither from himself is wise, he is not naturally good, or he doesn't have a good disposition. He doesn't possess the spirit of wisdom in himself, nor to assent to others can endure. He won't listen to the advice of experienced wise men. So even though he doesn't have a good spirit, that doesn't necessarily make him bad. But in addition to that, he doesn't listen to advice. He doesn't follow instruction from wise people. And when you have a person who doesn't have a good spirit and who does not listen to instruction, Hesiod says he is but a useless, despicable man. And such a man will never be able to succeed in the study of moral philosophy. The other two may, but this third may not. And so as we consider this study, we need to ask ourselves, do we have the right disposition? Do we sincerely desire to be good, to know what is good, and to do it? Even if we don't have a naturally good disposition, even if we don't have virtue and wisdom dwelling in us, almost by God's grace, if we're willing to listen, if we can be obedient to the teachings of wise men, we'll be okay. If we can simply follow the advice of wise men. And if we don't want to do that, we're going to be unhappy, as we'll learn in moral philosophy. We're going to have unhappy lives if we are neither good in ourselves and or don't listen to the advice of wise men. So whether we're qualified to be students of moral philosophy, it depends on whether or not we'll listen to the advice of wise men and follow that advice. If we're willing to do so, then we can do it. We can learn this wisdom and gain a knowledge of moral philosophy. So this is the end of chapter 4 of book 1 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. I know that I moved through a lot of information in this lesson pretty quickly, but I'm not worried about that because you can rewatch this video. You can take your time, watch this video again, and make sure you learn everything carefully. If you have any questions, you can get in touch with me, so there's nothing to worry about. I hope that you find this tutorial helpful in guiding you through the study of chapter 4. May God bless your studies. In this tutorial, we've studied chapter 4 of book 1 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Again, my name is William Michael. I'm the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and if you're interested in more resources in the study of the classical liberal arts or classical philosophy or even Catholic theology, visit us online at classicalliberalarts.com. God bless.